Along the winding banks of the Red River in Louisiana, where ancient cypress trees cast their shadows over waters that have witnessed centuries of human suffering, there stands a place that history tried to forget. Fairhaven was once home to some of the most prosperous cotton plantations in the Deep South, where fortunes were built on the backs of the enslaved and where the grand mansions rivaled those of European aristocracy. But beneath the veneer of Southern gentility, in the spring of 1861, a darkness festered that would soon consume everything in its path. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. This is not a story you will find in history books. It lives only in whispered memories passed down through generations, in fragments of truth that survivors carried to their graves, and in the charred remains of what was once considered the finest private library in all of Louisiana. It is the story of an 18-year-old girl whose gentle hands, trained in the delicate art of needlework, would become instruments of a justice so precise and devastating that it would reduce an empire of cruelty to ash and ember. The records speak of mysterious fires, of accidents that claimed the lives of prominent citizens, of unexplained disappearances that authorities attributed to the chaos of war. But the truth runs deeper than any official account. This is a story of secrets hidden behind locked doors, of literary knowledge used as a weapon, of a young woman who discovered that sometimes the only way to stop a monster is to burn down his lair while he sleeps within it. The Oakmont plantation sprawled across 1,800 acres of the most fertile land the Red River had ever nourished. Its fields of cotton and sugar cane stretched toward the horizon like a green ocean, worked by more than 200 enslaved souls whose labor had built one of Louisiana's most imposing fortunes. The main house rose from the landscape like a monument to human ambition, its 3 stories of Georgian architecture crowned with towering columns that could be seen from steamboats traveling the river trade routes. Benjamin Whitmore had inherited this empire from his father in 1840, along with a reputation that extended far beyond the borders of Louisiana. At 52, he commanded respect not only as a plantation owner, but as a deacon of Fairhaven's Baptist Church and a man whose word carried weight in the halls of power from Shreveport to New Orleans. His appearance reflected his status. Tall and imposing, with silver-streaked hair, always perfectly groomed and clothes tailored by the finest craftsmen in the state. But it was his eyes that those who knew him remembered most, pale blue and calculating, eyes that seemed to see people not as human beings, but as assets to be managed or obstacles to be removed. The Whitmore family had cultivated an image of Christian virtue and Southern honor that made them the envy of their peers. Benjamin's wife, Constance, at 48, had become the undisputed social leader of the region, organizing charity events for the church and hosting elaborate parties that brought together the elite from across northern Louisiana. She possessed the kind of refined beauty that age had only enhanced, with dark hair always arranged in the latest fashion and a wardrobe that rivaled those of Charleston and Savannah society ladies. Yet beneath her gracious exterior lay a steel determination to protect the family's reputation at any cost, a commitment that would prove both her strength and her downfall. Their son Daniel, 26 years old, had returned from his education at the University of Virginia with all the polish expected of a Southern gentleman. He had assumed the role of plantation overseer with the methodical precision his father demanded. But his time in Virginia had exposed him to ideas that troubled his sleep and challenged everything he had been taught about the natural order of society. Tall and lean like his father, but with softer features that suggested an internal conflict his position required him to suppress, Daniel found himself caught between family loyalty and a growing unease about the system that sustained their wealth. The family's daughter, Ruth, at 19, represented everything a Southern belle was supposed to embody. Beautiful, educated in the finest finishing schools, and trained in all the social graces required of her station, she should have been the perfect ornament to the Whitmore legacy. But Ruth possessed a curious mind and a rebellious spirit that her parents found increasingly difficult to contain. She had discovered books hidden away in her father's study, works by abolitionists and freethinkers that had opened her eyes to perspectives the Whitmore family would never publicly acknowledge. Her secret reading had planted seeds of doubt about everything she had been raised to believe, creating an internal revolution that would soon have external consequences. Among the enslaved community that sustained this grand facade, few names carried as much respect as Moses Freeman. At 45, Moses had worked at Oakmont since childhood, rising to become head stable hand through a combination of intelligence, reliability, and the kind of quiet dignity that even the most hardened overseers found difficult to break. His weathered hands could gentle the most spirited horse or craft tools with the skill of a master artisan. But it was his role as an unofficial leader and father figure to the younger enslaved people that truly defined his importance to the community. Moses had taken a special interest in a young woman named Clara Johnson, whose arrival at Oakmont 5 years earlier had marked the beginning of changes that would ultimately transform everything. Clara had come to Oakmont at the age of 13, purchased from a smaller plantation after her previous owner's death left his estate in chaos. What made Clara unique was not immediately apparent to those who saw only her small stature and gentle demeanor. At 18, she possessed hands that could create clothing and household linens of extraordinary beauty. But more dangerous still, she had somehow taught herself to read and write using discarded books and newspapers that found their way to the quarters. Her literacy was a secret she shared only with Moses, who understood the deadly risks such knowledge represented. In a society where educating enslaved people was not only forbidden but punishable by death, Clara's ability to read made her both incredibly valuable and impossibly dangerous. She had learned to hide her intelligence behind a mask of quiet compliance, speaking only when spoken to and moving through the main house like a shadow, always watching, always listening, always learning. Her position as seamstress gave her access to parts of the main house that other enslaved people never saw.
Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story.
People rarely saw. She spent hours in the upstairs sewing room, creating and mending the elaborate wardrobes that maintained the Whitmore family's image of prosperity and refinement. But more importantly, her work often required her to move through the house during evening hours, when conversations happened behind closed doors and secrets were revealed in whispered conferences. The Whitmore study occupied the ground floor corner of the mansion, its walls lined with thousands of books that represented not only knowledge but wealth and status. Benjamin had inherited many of these volumes from his father, but had added extensively to the collection during his travels to Charleston, New Orleans, and even as far as Boston and New York. The room served as both library and office, containing not only literature and philosophical works, but also all the plantation's business records, slave purchase documents, and correspondence with other plantation owners across the South. It was in this study that Benjamin conducted the business that sustained his empire, meeting with other plantation owners to coordinate prices and labor practices, corresponding with slave traders about new acquisitions, and maintaining the detailed records that tracked every aspect of his human property. The room's massive mahogany desk held ledger books that documented the lives and deaths of hundreds of people as mere entries in an accounting system, while filing cabinets contained contracts and bills of sale that reduced human beings to livestock transactions. Clara had first glimpsed the study's interior during her second year at the plantation, when Constance had sent her to deliver mended curtains. The sight of so many books had struck her like a physical blow, representing all the knowledge that was forbidden to someone of her station. She had managed to slip a slim volume into her sewing basket that day, a collection of poetry that she studied by candlelight until she had memorized every word before returning it to its place on the shelf. That first theft had led to others, always carefully planned and executed with the patience Moses had taught her. Clara learned to identify which books were rarely touched, which volumes could disappear for a few days without being missed. She developed an intricate system of borrowing and returning that allowed her to consume knowledge while leaving no trace of her activities. Through these stolen moments of education, she had discovered not only poetry and literature, but also political treatises, philosophical works, and, most dangerous of all, abolitionist writings that Benjamin kept hidden behind more conventional volumes. The plantation's daily routine followed the rigid patterns that had evolved over decades of slave labor. Before dawn, the field hands were roused by the overseer's bell and marched to the cotton and sugarcane fields where they would work until darkness fell. The house servants began their duties even earlier, preparing the elaborate meals and maintaining the spotless condition that kept the main house functioning as a showcase of Southern civilization. Clara's position as seamstress afforded her slightly more freedom of movement than other house servants, as her work could not be rushed and required good light and quiet concentration. It was during these seemingly routine days that Clara began to notice patterns in the Whitmore family's behavior that troubled her growing understanding of the world beyond the plantation. Benjamin's frequent trips to town often resulted in hushed conversations with Daniel about financial pressures that seemed inconsistent with the family's outward prosperity. Constance's increasing anxiety about maintaining social appearances suggested that the Whitmore fortune might not be as secure as it appeared. Most disturbing of all were the moments when Clara glimpsed the family's private interactions, seeing the careful control and hidden tensions that existed behind their public facade of domestic harmony. Ruth Whitmore had begun to seek out Clara's company during her sewing work, initially claiming she wanted to learn domestic skills that her formal education had overlooked. But Clara soon realized that Ruth's visits were motivated by something deeper than curiosity about needlework. The young woman seemed hungry for conversation with someone who might offer a different perspective on the world, someone who existed outside the carefully controlled social circle that defined her daily life. These conversations began innocently enough, with Ruth asking about Clara's techniques for creating intricate embroidery patterns or her methods for selecting and blending fabrics. But gradually, their discussions evolved into something more complex and dangerous. Ruth began sharing her observations about the contradictions she saw in their society, the gap between Christian teachings about human dignity and the reality of slavery, the inconsistency between ideals of freedom and the system that sustained their comfort. Clara found herself in an impossible position during these exchanges. Ruth's questions demanded honesty, but providing that honesty could result in severe punishment for both of them. Clara had learned to navigate these conversations with careful ambiguity, offering observations that could be interpreted multiple ways while never directly challenging the assumptions that Ruth was beginning to question on her own. She sensed that Ruth was undergoing her own internal revolution, but Clara understood that her role was to listen rather than to guide, to provide a safe space for Ruth's own discoveries rather than to risk exposure by pushing too hard or too fast. The spring of 1861 brought changes to the plantation that affected everyone from the main house to the quarters. News of secession and the formation of the Confederacy had created an atmosphere of excitement and anxiety that permeated every aspect of daily life. Benjamin threw himself into organizing support for the new Confederate government, hosting meetings in his study where local plantation owners discussed their contributions to the war effort and planned for the challenges that military conflict would bring to their agricultural operations. Daniel found himself torn between family expectations and personal doubts as pressure mounted for young men of his station to demonstrate their commitment to the Confederate cause regardless of his private reservations. His education in Virginia exposed him to Northern perspectives that complicated his ability to embrace the Southern narrative of righteous rebellion. But his position as heir to the Whitmore legacy required him to project enthusiasm for the cause regardless of his private reservations. For the enslaved community, the war represented both hope and terror. Whispered conversations in the quarters speculated about what Union victory might mean for their futures, but they also understood that any hope of emancipation would likely come only at the cost of utter destruction and chaos.
Freedom would come at an enormous cost. Moses counseled patience and caution, warning against any actions that might invite violent retaliation, while the white community was already on edge about threats to their way of life. Clara absorbed all of these tensions while maintaining her careful facade of compliant service. Her access to the study during her sewing duties allowed her to overhear conversations about Confederate strategy, financial pressures, and the family's plans for protecting their assets if Union forces approached the region. More importantly, she began to understand how the war was affecting the delicate balance of power and fear that had maintained the plantation system for so long. It was during one of these evening sessions in the study, while Benjamin met with neighboring plantation owners to discuss wartime security measures, that Clara made a discovery that would change everything. Hidden behind a row of agricultural journals, she found a leather-bound volume that contained not books, but correspondence and documents that revealed the true nature of Benjamin's business operations. The papers detailed not only slave purchases and sales, but also more sinister activities. The breeding of enslaved people like livestock, the separation of families for profit, and most shocking of all, correspondence with traders who specialized in providing young enslaved women for purposes that the euphemistic language could not completely disguise. Among these documents, Clara discovered evidence of financial arrangements that would affect the future of everyone at Oakmont. Benjamin had borrowed heavily against his human property to finance Confederate bonds and military supplies, gambling that Southern victory would multiply his investments. But the correspondence also revealed backup plans that chilled Clara to her core. Detailed arrangements for selling entire families if financial pressure required rapid liquidation of assets. Most devastating of all was a specific list that included her own name alongside those of other young women, marked for potential sale to a New Orleans establishment that Benjamin's correspondence described only as catering to particular clientele. The implications were clear enough to make Clara's hand shake as she read, understanding that her own future and that of other women she cared about hung in the balance of financial decisions that treated them as mere commodities. The discovery of these documents marked the end of Clara's ability to maintain passive observation. She understood now that the time for patience and careful maneuvering was rapidly running out, that external pressures and internal weaknesses were pushing the Whitmore family toward decisions that would destroy the lives of everyone around them. The war that had seemed like a distant event was becoming immediate and personal, forcing Clara to confront the reality that survival might require action rather than endurance. That night, as she returned the documents to their hiding place and made her way back to the quarters, Clara felt something fundamental shift inside her. The girl who had learned to read in secret and navigate dangerous conversations with careful ambiguity was evolving into someone more dangerous. A young woman who understood that knowledge without action was merely another form of powerlessness, and that sometimes the only way to protect those you love is to destroy those who threaten them. The seeds of what would come to be known as the Fairhaven Fire had been planted in that moment of discovery, watered by years of accumulated injustice, and nurtured by the realization that the very literacy that had opened Clara's eyes to the world had also revealed the full extent of the prison that surrounded her. The study that had been her secret sanctuary of learning would soon become the focal point of a justice as precise and devastating as any lesson those books had ever taught her. Of the main house, she wielded power over the daily lives of house servants with the precision of a conductor directing an orchestra. Every meal, every cleaning schedule, every social event was orchestrated according to her exacting standards, and any deviation from her expectations resulted in swift and humiliating punishment. But Constance's cruelty extended beyond mere household management. She had developed a particular expertise in psychological warfare that targeted the most vulnerable aspects of enslaved women's lives. She understood that the deepest pain came not from physical punishment, but from the threat of separation from children and loved ones. Constance had made it clear through word and deed that any resistance to her authority would result in family members being sold away, often to owners known for particular brutality. Her social position as a church leader and community organizer gave Constance additional tools for maintaining control. She had cultivated relationships with wives of other plantation owners throughout the region, creating an informal network that shared information about troublesome enslaved people and coordinated responses to any signs of resistance. This network operated through seemingly innocent social gatherings and charitable activities, but its true purpose was to ensure that no enslaved person could escape the reach of their collective surveillance. Constance took particular pleasure in her role as the arbiter of moral standards within the enslaved community. She insisted on approving all marriages between enslaved people, often denying permission for unions that might create stronger family bonds or emotional support systems. When she did permit marriages, she made it clear that the continued existence of these relationships depended entirely on her goodwill and the absolute compliance of all family members. The overseer's assistant, Jake Morrison, represented a different but equally dangerous form of oppression. Morrison came from the class of poor whites who owned no property but depended on plantation owners for employment and social status. His position gave him power over enslaved people while keeping him firmly subordinate to the Whitmer family, creating a combination of authority and resentment that made him particularly vicious in his treatment of those beneath him. Morrison had grown up in poverty that made him desperate to distinguish himself from enslaved people in any way possible. He understood that his only claim to superiority lay in the color of his skin and the backing of wealthy plantation owners, which made him fanatically committed to maintaining the racial hierarchy that provided his only source of self-worth. His cruelty was not calculated like Daniel's or refined like Constance's, but raw and desperate, driven by his need to prove his worthiness to employers who viewed him as barely more valuable than the people he supervised. Jake Morrison's particular area of expertise was the breaking of newly acquired enslaved people who had not yet learned to accept their situation. He had developed a repertoire of techniques designed to destroy any sense of dignity or hope that new arrivals might still possess. His methods included prolonged isolation, sleep deprivation, and systematic humiliation that continued until victims demonstrated complete submission to their new circumstances. Dr. Henry Patterson occupied a unique position in the plantation's power structure as the family physician whose medical knowledge gave him access to forms of control unavailable to others. Patterson had studied medicine in Philadelphia before returning to Louisiana, where he had discovered that his skills could be used for purposes far removed from healing. His medical training allowed him to inflict pain without leaving permanent damage, to keep people alive when death might have been preferable, and to provide scientific justification for the plantation's most brutal practices. Patterson's involvement went beyond treating injuries and illnesses among the enslaved population. He had become an expert in what he termed the medical management of human property, advising Benjamin on nutrition levels that would maintain worker productivity while minimizing costs.
developing medications that could control behavior and suppress resistance, and providing medical documentation that justified the sale or punishment of individuals who posed threats to plantation stability. The doctor's most disturbing contribution to the plantation's operations was his role in the selective breeding programs that Benjamin had implemented to increase the value of his human property. Patterson provided medical examinations that evaluated enslaved women for their potential as breeding stock, maintained records of pregnancies and births that tracked genetic traits like livestock records, and supervised the forced separations of children from their mothers when they reached ages that made independent sale profitable. Clara's position as seamstress had given her glimpses into the operations of this network of cruelty, but her discovery of Benjamin's hidden documents had revealed the true scope and coordination of their activities. The correspondence she had found included detailed exchanges between Benjamin and other plantation owners about techniques for managing enslaved populations, sharing information about individuals who had attempted to escape or resist, and coordinating prices for the sale of people between plantations. Most chilling were the medical reports from Dr. Patterson that accompanied some of these letters. These documents provided clinical assessments of enslaved people's physical and mental conditions, often recommending specific punishments or treatments designed to modify behavior. Patterson's reports read like veterinary examinations, evaluating human beings according to their productivity, compliance, and breeding potential with the cold detachment of scientific observation. The letters also revealed the extent to which the Whitmer family's operations were integrated into a larger regional system of oppression. They corresponded regularly with slave traders in New Orleans, Charleston, and Mobile, receiving advance notice of new arrivals and special requests for individuals with particular skills or physical characteristics. They participated in a network that tracked runaway enslaved people across state lines, sharing information and resources to ensure that escape attempts were quickly discovered and severely punished. These letters described these activities in matter-of-fact terms, detailing the methods used to track fugitives, the punishments inflicted upon their return, and the coordination between multiple plantations to prevent future escape attempts.
These discoveries had forced Clara to confront the reality that the Whitmore family's cruelty was not simply the result of individual character flaws, but part of a systematic approach to maintaining power that extended far beyond their own plantation. She understood now that any resistance would have to account for this larger network of oppression, that escape or rebellion would face not just local opposition, but coordinated regional response. The knowledge had also revealed to Clara the true precariousness of her own position and that of everyone she cared about. The documents made it clear that Benjamin viewed his enslaved people not as human beings with any inherent rights, but as investments that could be modified, traded, or liquidated according to market conditions and personal preferences. The list that included her name alongside other young women was not an aberration, but part of ongoing business operations that treated human trafficking as routine commerce. Clara's growing understanding of the system she faced had begun to transform her from a careful observer into someone actively seeking leverage and opportunity. Her literacy, which had once been simply a source of personal fulfillment and secret pride, had become a weapon that allowed her to understand her enemy's plans and weaknesses. She began to approach her access to the study not as a chance for education, but as intelligence gathering that might reveal opportunities for action. The spring of 1861 was bringing changes that offered both dangers and possibilities. The war had created new pressures on plantation operations, while also disrupting the networks of communication and control that had maintained stability in the region. Clara sensed that the carefully maintained balance of power was becoming unstable, creating conditions where bold action might succeed, where patience had only led to greater oppression. Her observations of the Whitmore family's increasing anxiety about financial and political pressures suggested that their confidence in their own security was beginning to crack.
The letters she had discovered revealed mounting debts and risky investments that had left them vulnerable to economic collapse if the war did not proceed according to their expectations. For the first time since her arrival at the plantation, Clara began to see her oppressors not as omnipotent forces, but as human beings whose power depended on circumstances that might be subject to change. The realization that the Whitmore family was not invulnerable had planted the first seeds of what would eventually become Clara's plan for justice.
About individual enslaved people on his property and others throughout the region. These files contain detailed information about family relationships, personal histories, and individual characteristics that could be used for control or exploitation. Clara found records about herself that included observations about her intelligence, her relationship with Moses, and speculation about her potential value in various markets. The discovery of her own file had been particularly shocking because it revealed the extent to which Benjamin had been watching and evaluating her without her knowledge. The records noted her skill with needlework, her quiet demeanor, and her apparent literacy, though Benjamin seemed uncertain about the extent of her education. Most ominously, the file included a note questioning whether Clara's intelligence made her a valuable asset or a potential threat that required careful monitoring. Among the family's correspondence, Clara had found letters that revealed the true extent of their financial difficulties and the desperate measures they were considering to maintain their lifestyle. Benjamin had borrowed heavily against his human property to invest in Confederate bonds and military contracts, gambling that Southern victory would multiply his wealth. But the letters also revealed backup plans that involved liquidating assets through slave sales if their investments failed to produce expected returns. These financial pressures had led to increasingly frequent correspondence with slave traders in New Orleans and other markets, discussing the potential sale of specific individuals or family groups. Clara discovered that several people she knew well had already been evaluated for sale, with detailed assessments of their skills, health, and market value. The casual tone of these letters, discussing human beings like livestock or merchandise, had reinforced Clara's understanding that the Whitmore family viewed their enslaved people as nothing more than property to be exploited or disposed of according to their convenience. The correspondence also revealed ongoing discussions about expanding certain aspects of their operations that Clara found particularly disturbing. Benjamin had been exploring opportunities to provide enslaved women to establishments in New Orleans that catered to specific clientele with payments that far exceeded normal sale prices. The euphemistic language used in these letters could not disguise the nature of these arrangements or the fate that awaited women selected for such purposes. Clara's name appeared on multiple lists related to these discussions, along with those of other young women whose physical appearance and demeanor made them candidates for this particular form of exploitation. The letters discussed timing, transportation arrangements, and financial terms with the same business-like precision used for any commercial transaction, treating the destruction of human lives as a routine business opportunity. These discoveries had forced Clara to confront the reality that her time at Oakmort was limited and that passive resistance was no longer sufficient to protect herself or others she cared about. The Whitmore family's financial pressures and wartime uncertainties were creating conditions where previously unthinkable decisions were becoming practical necessities in their minds. Clara understood that she needed to act before these plans moved beyond the discussion stage. Her growing knowledge of the family's operations had also revealed potential weaknesses that might be exploited. The financial records showed that Benjamin's investments had left him vulnerable to market fluctuations and dependent on Confederate success for his economic survival. His correspondence revealed anxieties about Union military advances and concerns about maintaining control over his enslaved population if federal forces approached the region. More importantly, Clara had discovered evidence of tensions within the Whitmore family itself that suggested their united front was more fragile than it appeared. Letters between Benjamin and his business associates included complaints about Daniel's lack of enthusiasm for certain aspects of plantation management and concerns about his reliability in crisis situations. References to Ruth's inappropriate interests and friendships suggested that Benjamin was struggling to maintain control over his own family's loyalty and discretion.
The study's role as the nerve center of Whitmore operations had made it both the source of Clara's intelligence and the obvious target for any action she might take against the family. The room contained not only the documentary evidence of their crimes, but also the financial records and correspondence that sustained their power. Destroying the study would eliminate their ability to conduct business, coordinate with other plantation owners, and maintain the networks that made their operations possible. Clara had begun to study the study itself as carefully as she had studied its contents, noting the materials used in its construction, the ventilation patterns that affected air circulation, and the potential for fire to spread from the room to other parts of the house. Her knowledge of fabrics and materials from her sewing work had given her insights into combustibility and fire behavior that most people lacked. She understood which materials would burn quickly and which would create the most heat and smoke. The study's location on the ground floor of the house made it accessible from multiple directions, but also positioned it where fire could spread rapidly to other areas of the building. The extensive collection of books and papers provided abundant fuel, while the heavy wooden furniture and thick carpets would sustain and intensify any blaze that began in the room. The tall windows could provide escape routes for occupants, but could also create drafts that would accelerate fire spread. Clara's observations had also revealed the study's importance to Benjamin's nightly routine and his sense of security. He often worked late into the evening when business pressures were particularly intense, sometimes falling asleep at his desk over ledgers and correspondence. The thick walls and closed door muffled sound from the rest of the house, creating an isolated environment where someone inside might not immediately notice danger approaching from outside. These observations had begun to coalesce into the outline of a plan that would use Clara's knowledge and access to destroy not only the Whitmore family's records, but Benjamin himself. The study that had been her secret sanctuary of learning and her understanding of the world beyond the plantation would become the instrument of justice, consuming the evidence of decades of cruelty along with the man who had orchestrated it all. The irony was not lost on Clara that the room where she had discovered her love of learning and her understanding of the world beyond the plantation would also become the site of her revenge against those who had tried to limit her humanity to their narrow definitions of property and profit. The books that had opened her mind to possibilities beyond slavery would fuel the fire that would free her from its constraints forever. Part 4. Ruth's Awakening. The relationship between Clara and Ruth Whitmore had evolved through a series of careful conversations that neither young woman could have predicted when they first began spending time together in the upstairs sewing room. What had started as Ruth's curiosity about domestic skills had gradually transformed into something much more complex and dangerous, a friendship that crossed racial and social boundaries in ways that could destroy both their lives if discovered. Ruth's initial interest in learning needlework had been genuine, born from a growing awareness that her formal education had left her unprepared for many practical aspects of life. Her time at finishing school in Charleston had taught her French, piano, literature, and all the social graces expected of a Southern belle, but she had never learned the domestic skills that actually sustained households like hers. The irony that enslaved women possessed knowledge and abilities that she lacked had begun to trouble Ruth's understanding of the natural hierarchies she had been taught to accept without question. Clara had approached these early lessons with the same careful discretion she applied to all her interactions with the Whitmore family. She taught Ruth basic stitching techniques and fabric selection while maintaining the deferential manner expected of an enslaved person, but Ruth's questions had quickly moved beyond simple instruction to more complex discussions about the creative and artistic aspects of needlework. Clara found herself explaining design principles, color theory, and the cultural traditions behind different embroidery patterns, sharing knowledge that revealed the depth of her intelligence and education. These conversations had gradually revealed to Ruth that Clara possessed a sophistication and wisdom that challenged everything Ruth had been taught about the intellectual capacity of enslaved people. Clara's insights into literature, when Ruth cautiously tested her knowledge, demonstrated not only literacy, but genuine understanding of complex themes and ideas. Most shocking of all was Clara's apparent familiarity with philosophical and political concepts that Ruth herself had only recently encountered through her secret reading in her father's study. Ruth's discovery of Clara's education had created a crisis of understanding that shook the foundations of everything she believed about her world. If Clara could think and feel and understand with the same depth as any white person, then the entire justification for slavery became not just questionable, but obviously false. The realization forced Ruth to confront the possibility that her family's wealth and status were built not on natural superiority, but on systematic oppression of people who differed from her only in circumstances of birth. The process of recognizing Clara's humanity had been gradual and painful for Ruth, requiring her to abandon comfortable assumptions about her own inherent worth and the righteousness of her family's way of life. Each conversation with Clara had provided new evidence that the racial hierarchies she had been taught to accept were artificial constructions designed to benefit people like her at the expense of people like Clara. The knowledge was liberating and terrifying in equal measure, opening her eyes to injustices she had never recognized while making her complicit in systems she now understood to be evil. Clara, for her part, had watched Ruth's awakening with a mixture of hope and wariness. She recognized the genuine struggle in Ruth's questions and observations, but she also understood that Ruth's position as a Whitmore made her potentially dangerous regardless of her personal beliefs. Any conversation that revealed Clara's true thoughts about slavery and the Whitmore family could result in severe punishment, while Ruth's emotional turmoil about these revelations could lead her to seek guidance from family members who would view Clara as a corrupting influence requiring elimination. The delicate balance of their relationship required Clara to encourage Ruth's questioning while never directly challenging the assumptions Ruth was already beginning to doubt on her own. Clara learned to respond to Ruth's observations with careful ambiguity, offering perspectives that could be interpreted as simple common sense rather than dangerous political ideas. She provided information about the experiences of enslaved people without directly criticizing the system that oppressed them, allowing Ruth to draw her own conclusions about the implications of what she was learning. Ruth's growing awareness of the contradictions in her society had been accelerated by her secret reading in her father's study, where she had discovered abolitionist literature hidden behind more conventional volumes. Works by Frederick Douglass, Harriet Beecher Stowe, and other critics of slavery had provided Ruth with the vocabulary and concepts for understanding the injustices she was beginning to recognize in her daily life. These readings had prepared her to appreciate the full significance of Clara's intelligence and humanity in ways that might not have been possible without that intellectual foundation. The combination of abolitionist literature and personal relationship with Clara had created a revolutionary transformation in Ruth's worldview that she struggled to reconcile with her continued existence within the Whitmore household. She found herself unable to participate in family conversations about enslaved people without feeling disgust at the casual dehumanization that characterized their attitudes. Social gatherings with other plantation families had become exercises of endurance as she listened to discussions about human beings as property and investments. Most disturbing to Ruth was her growing awareness of her own family's particular cruelties and the extent to which their wealth depended on activities that she now recognized as morally indefensible. Her father's reputation as a respectable Christian gentleman seemed increasingly hollow as she observed his treatment of enslaved people and overheard conversations about business activities that reduced human beings to commercial transactions. Her mother's social leadership and charitable activities appeared hypocritical when contrasted with her harsh treatment of house servants and her casual acceptance of family separation and sale. Daniel's role as overseer had become particularly difficult for Ruth to accept as she developed a clearer understanding of what his position actually entailed. Her brother's education and apparent sophistication had always made her proud, but his willing participation in the plantation's operations now seemed like a betrayal of everything education represented to Ruth's better instincts.
Was supposed to represent. The gap between Daniel's intellectual capabilities and his moral choices had forced Ruth to confront the reality that knowledge and goodness were not automatically connected. Ruth's internal revolution had begun to affect her behavior in ways that concerned her family and created additional risks for Clara. She had become withdrawn from social activities, declining invitations to parties and gatherings that had previously been important parts of her life. Her conversations with family members had become stilted and uncomfortable as she struggled to avoid expressing opinions that would reveal her changing beliefs. Most dangerously, she had begun asking questions about family business and plantation operations that suggested an inappropriate interest in matters that were considered beyond her proper concerns. Clara had recognized the signs of Ruth's growing alienation from her family and understood that the situation was becoming dangerous for both of them. Ruth's emotional distress about her discoveries was making her careless about concealing her feelings, while her desire to discuss her revelations with someone who would understand was putting pressure on their relationship that Clara feared might lead to exposure. The friendship that had begun as a source of intellectual stimulation and human connection was becoming a liability that threatened Clara's carefully maintained security. The crisis had come when Ruth discovered evidence of her father's correspondence about selling enslaved people to establishments in New Orleans. Ruth's reaction to this discovery had been immediate and overwhelming, forcing her to confront the reality that her family was involved in activities that went beyond the already problematic practice of slavery, to include forms of exploitation that shocked even her developing moral sensibilities. Her distress had been so obvious that Clara feared Ruth might reveal their relationship in her emotional turmoil. Clara's response to Ruth's crisis had required all of her accumulated wisdom about survival and discretion. She had provided comfort and support while carefully steering the conversation away from any direct criticism of the Whitmore family that could be used against her if Ruth's loyalties ultimately remained with her birth family. She had helped Ruth understand that knowledge carried responsibilities, but also dangers, that acting on moral insights required careful planning rather than emotional outbursts. The conversation had also allowed Clara to gauge Ruth's potential as an ally rather than simply a source of information. Ruth's genuine horror at her father's activities and her expressed desire to find ways to help enslaved people suggested that her transformation might be complete enough to make her a willing participant in actions against her own family. The possibility that Ruth might actively assist in undermining the Whitmore operations had opened new strategic possibilities that Clara had begun to explore. Ruth's position within the family gave her access to information and opportunities that could be invaluable to any plan for resistance or escape. Her knowledge of family routines, her ability to move through the house without suspicion, and her access to keys and resources could provide crucial support for actions that Clara could not accomplish alone. Most importantly, Ruth's emotional investment in proving her rejection of her family's values might make her willing to take risks that would be unthinkable for someone whose primary motivation was simple self-preservation. Clara had begun testing Ruth's commitment through carefully designed conversations that revealed progressively more dangerous information about the enslaved community's knowledge and feelings about their situation. Ruth's responses had demonstrated not only acceptance of these revelations, but eager interest in learning more about the perspectives of people her family had taught her to view as objects rather than human beings. Her questions showed genuine desire to understand and help rather than mere curiosity about exotic experiences.
The relationship between Clara and Ruth had become a crucial element in Clara's developing plans for action against the Whitmore family. Ruth's willingness to question everything she had been taught and her emotional commitment to rejecting her family's values had made her a potential ally whose inside knowledge and access could be decisive in any confrontation with the plantation's power structure. The study where Clara had learned to read and Ruth had discovered abolitionist literature had become the unlikely birthplace of an alliance that would soon challenge everything the Whitmore family represented. The irony that Benjamin's own collection of forbidden books had created the intellectual foundation for resistance to his authority was not lost on Clara as she contemplated the ways his most prized possessions might become the instruments of his destruction. The knowledge contained in those volumes had opened both young women's eyes to possibilities beyond the limitations their society had tried to impose on them, preparing them for actions that would transform both their lives forever. Part 5. The Witness Network. The enslaved community at Oakmont had developed its own intricate system of communication and surveillance that operated parallel to the official power structure imposed by the Whitmore family. This network had evolved over decades of shared oppression, creating bonds of mutual protection and information sharing that allowed people to survive in an environment designed to isolate and dehumanize them. Clara's growing involvement in resistance planning had made her increasingly reliant on this network, while also forcing her to expand and refine its capabilities. Moses Freeman's role as an unofficial leader within the enslaved community had made her Clara's most important ally and advisor as she contemplated actions against the Whitmore family. His decades of experience at Oakmont had taught him to read the subtle signs that indicated changes in the plantation's power dynamics, while his natural wisdom and moral authority made him someone that others trusted with their most dangerous secrets. Moses had recognized Clara's potential from her earliest days at the plantation, but her recent revelations about the family's plans had convinced him that careful resistance was becoming necessary for survival. Moses's position as head stable hand had given him unique insights into the Whitmore family's vulnerabilities and the broader political situation affecting the region. His work required him to interact with visitors from other plantations, traveling businessmen, and occasionally with Confederate officials, providing him with information about military developments and regional conditions that was unavailable to other enslaved people. More importantly, his responsibilities included maintaining the horses and their companions, which were understandably valuable among the most vulnerable and despairing members of the community. The groups of horses enslaved people had developed into networks that shared information and provided mutual protection against the many threats faced by the enslaved community.
Vehicles that would be essential for any escape attempt, giving him practical knowledge about transportation options and travel routes. The stable complex where Moses worked had become an informal meeting place where information was shared and plans could be discussed with relative privacy. The sounds of horses and routine maintenance activities provided cover for conversations that would be dangerous if overheard, while the legitimate reasons for people to visit the stables made it possible for Clara and others to meet without arousing suspicion. Moses had carefully cultivated this environment as a resource for the community while maintaining the appearance of simple compliance with his assigned duties. Betsy Williams, the head cook, controlled another crucial node in the plantation's communication network through her position in the kitchen that served both the main house and the quarters. Her work required her to interact with house servants, field hands, and family members throughout each day, making her privy to conversations and observations from across the plantation's social spectrum. Betsy's warm personality and maternal instincts had made her a confidant for many people who shared information and concerns they would not trust with others. The kitchen itself had become a gathering place where news and rumors were exchanged along with meals and informal social interaction. Betsy's skill at reading people and situations had made her an effective coordinator of information, able to distinguish between reliable reports and mere speculation, while identifying patterns that revealed important developments before they became obvious to casual observers.
Her ability to maintain multiple conversations while appearing to focus entirely on cooking had made her an ideal facilitator for the careful discussions that were becoming necessary as Clara's plans developed. Betsy's 3 children, who worked in various capacities around the plantation, had been trained by their mother to observe and remember details that might be important to the community's safety and well-being. This training had created a network of young people who could move through different areas of the plantation without attracting attention, while gathering information about family activities, visitor arrivals, and changes in routine that might signal important developments. Their youth and apparent innocence made them ideal sources of intelligence that complemented the more formal surveillance conducted by adults. The field hands, led informally by a man named Samuel Porter, represented the largest component of the enslaved community and the group most directly affected by the brutal working conditions that sustained the plantation's profitability. Samuel's natural leadership abilities and his reputation for fairness in disputes had made him a respected voice in community decisions, while his knowledge of the surrounding countryside from years of agricultural work had given him expertise that would be valuable for any resistance activities that extended beyond the plantation's boundaries. Samuel's network included people who worked in different sections of the plantation's extensive fields, providing comprehensive coverage of activities that occurred away from the main house and quarters. These workers had developed sophisticated methods of communication that used work songs, hand signals, and coded conversations to share information across distances that would otherwise make coordination impossible. Their knowledge of seasonal patterns, weather conditions, and agricultural schedules had made them experts at predicting when various activities would provide opportunities for unobserved movement or action. The field workers network had also established connections with enslaved people on neighboring plantations through the informal social interactions that occurred during market days, church services, and other occasions when different communities came into contact. These connections provided information about regional conditions, travel routes, and potential allies that extended the reach of Clara's intelligence gathering far beyond the boundaries of Oakmont itself. Clara's relationship with this broader network had been carefully cultivated through her association with Moses and her reputation for intelligence and discretion. The community had gradually come to trust her with increasingly sensitive information as they recognized her potential for leadership and her commitment to their collective welfare. Her literacy had made her particularly valuable as someone who could read and interpret documents that others encountered but could not understand, while her access to the main house had provided her with information that was unavailable to people whose work kept them in other areas of the plantation. The network's effectiveness had been demonstrated repeatedly through its ability to predict and prepare for various challenges that affected the community. Advance warning about planned punishments had allowed people to take precautions that minimized harm to themselves and their families. Information about visitor arrivals had enabled the community to modify their behavior to avoid unwanted attention. Most importantly, the network had successfully concealed various forms of resistance and mutual aid that would have resulted in severe punishment if discovered by the Whitmore family. Clara's discovery of Benjamin's correspondence about selling community members had created the most serious crisis the network had faced since its formation. The revelation that multiple people were being evaluated for sale had forced the community to confront the reality that their current situation was becoming untenable and that passive resistance was no longer sufficient to protect their most vulnerable members. The network had responded by expanding its intelligence-gathering activities and beginning to consider more active forms of resistance than they had previously contemplated against the plantation's power structure. The integration of Ruth Whitmore into this planning process had required careful consideration and extensive discussion within the network. Ruth's transformation from privileged daughter to potential ally had been observed and evaluated by multiple community members who had their own experiences with her behavior and attitudes. The consensus had emerged that Ruth's change was genuine, and that her position within the family made her too valuable as an asset to reject, despite the obvious risks of trusting someone from the oppressor class. Clara's relationship with Ruth had provided the network with unprecedented access to information about family discussions, financial records, and future plans that would have been impossible to obtain through traditional surveillance methods. Ruth's willingness to share this information and her emotional commitment. Part 6. The weight of dangerous knowledge. The summer heat of 1861 settled over Fairhaven like a suffocating blanket, intensifying not only the physical discomfort of daily labor, but also the psychological pressure that had been building within the Oakmont plantation community. Clara's revelations about Benjamin's correspondence had created ripples of anxiety and determination that affected every aspect of life in the quarters, while the main house seemed to vibrate with its own tensions as the war progressed and financial pressures mounted. Betsy Williams had become the unofficial coordinator of information flowing through the community, her position in the kitchen making her the natural hub for conversations that needed to appear casual while carrying deadly serious intelligence. The morning after Clara shared the details of Benjamin's plans for selling community members to New Orleans establishments, Betsy had quietly modified her routine to create opportunities for extended conversations with key people throughout the plantation. Her first priority had been confirming the safety of the women whose names appeared on Benjamin's lists. The casual manner in which the correspondents discussed their potential sale had made clear that the timeline for these transactions could accelerate rapidly if financial pressures increased or if military developments created urgency around liquidating assets. Betsy's maternal instincts had been aroused by the clinical assessment of young women she had helped raise and protect, transforming her usual caution into fierce determination to prevent their exploitation. The kitchen conversations that followed had revealed the extent to which the community had already been aware of unusual activities and discussions among the Whitmore family. Several house servants had noticed increased visits from strangers who conducted business with Benjamin in his study, meetings that were conducted with unusual secrecy and often extended late into the evening. Field workers had observed the arrival of well-dressed men who appeared to be evaluating people and property with the calculating attention of potential buyers. Most disturbing had been reports from those who worked closest to the family about changes in their behavior and conversations. Daniel's increased agitation and his more frequent consultations with his father about matters he would not discuss with other overseers suggested that major decisions were being contemplated. Constance's heightened attention to the appearance and behavior of house servants, combined with her unusual interest in their family relationships and personal histories, indicated that detailed evaluations were being conducted for purposes that remained unclear to casual observers. The accumulation of these observations had created a picture of accelerating preparation for major changes that confirmed Clara's documentary evidence while adding details that the correspondence had not revealed. The community's collective intelligence network had identified patterns of activity that suggested Benjamin's plans were moving beyond the discussion stage toward actual implementation, creating urgency around any response they might organize. Samuel Porter had taken responsibility for expanding the network's surveillance of activities in areas beyond the main house and immediate quarters. His leadership among the field workers had allowed him to organize systematic observation of all visitors to the plantation, tracking their arrival and departure times, their apparent business with the family, and any conversations or activities that might provide clues about their purposes. This expanded surveillance had revealed the extent to which Oakmont was connected to regional networks of slave traders and business associates who specialized in particular forms of human trafficking.
The field workers' observations had also identified potential escape routes and hiding places that might be necessary if the community needed to respond to immediate threats. Samuel's knowledge of the surrounding countryside had proven invaluable in mapping paths through forests and swampland that could provide concealment for people fleeing the plantation, while his contacts with enslaved people on neighboring properties had revealed potential allies and safe havens that could support extended resistance activities. More importantly, Samuel's network had gathered intelligence about regional military and political developments that affected the security situation around Fairhaven. Reports from enslaved people who traveled with their owners to town or who encountered Confederate soldiers and officials revealed information about troop movements, supply shortages, and growing tensions between military authorities and civilian plantation owners who were struggling to maintain control over their enslaved populations. This regional intelligence had painted a picture of increasing instability that created both opportunities and dangers for any resistance activities the Oakmont community might undertake. Union military advances in other parts of Louisiana encouraged escape attempts and open rebellion on several plantations, leading to brutal crackdowns by Confederate authorities who were determined to prevent the spread of insurrection. The success of these escape attempts demonstrated that organized resistance was possible, but the severity of punishments inflicted on captured fugitives had made clear the deadly consequences of failed attempts. Moses Freeman's position in the stables had provided him with unique insights into the family's preparations for potential evacuation or emergency response to military threats. His observations of increased maintenance on vehicles and harnesses, combined with unusual attention to the condition and training of horses, suggested that the Whitmore family was preparing for rapid departure if circumstances required abandoning the plantation.
Implications for any resistance activities, as they indicated both the family's growing anxiety about their security and their continued access to transportation resources that could be used for escape or for summoning help. Moses had also become aware of discussions between Benjamin and Daniel about defensive measures that might be necessary if Union forces approached the region, or if local enslaved populations attempted organized rebellion. These conversations had revealed the family's awareness of their vulnerability and their recognition that their control over the plantation depended ultimately on external military support rather than their own resources. The knowledge that the Whitmore family felt threatened had provided the community with psychological leverage, while also highlighting the potential for extreme violence if they perceived immediate danger to their authority. The stable environment had become a crucial meeting place where Clara could consult with Moses about the practical aspects of any action she might take against the family. Moses' wisdom and experience had helped her understand the importance of careful timing and thorough preparation, while his knowledge of the family's routines and security measures had allowed him to identify potential weaknesses that could be exploited. Most importantly, his moral authority within the community had provided Clara with the confidence that her developing plans had the support and blessing of someone whose judgment was respected by everyone at Oakmont. Clara's relationship with Ruth Whitmore had become increasingly complex, as both young women struggled with the implications of their friendship and their shared knowledge of the family's activities. Ruth's emotional distress about her discoveries had made her a potentially dangerous ally, as her guilt and anger about her family's crimes threatened to overwhelm her ability to maintain the discretion that was essential for any successful resistance activity. Clara had found herself in the position of counseling Ruth about managing her emotions while simultaneously gathering information that would be essential for planning actions against Ruth's own family. The psychological burden of this relationship had been compounded by Clara's growing awareness that Ruth's cooperation might be essential for the success of any plan she developed. Ruth's access to keys, her knowledge of family schedules, and her ability to move through the house without suspicion made her potentially invaluable as an accomplice. However, her emotional volatility and her lack of experience with the kind of careful planning that survival required made her a risky partner whose involvement could jeopardize everything. Clara's conversations with Ruth had revealed the extent to which the young white woman was struggling with questions of identity and loyalty that paralleled Clara's own moral challenges.
Ruth's rejection of her family's values had left her emotionally adrift, uncertain about her place in a world where her previous assumptions about right and wrong had been shattered. Her desire to take action against her family's crimes was genuine, but her understanding of the risks and practical challenges involved was limited by her privileged background and lack of experience with the violent realities that governed relationships between enslaved people and their owners. The development of trust between Clara and Ruth had required both young women to overcome deeply ingrained assumptions about race and social position that had been reinforced throughout their lives. For Clara, accepting Ruth as a genuine ally meant moving beyond the survival-based suspicion that had protected her throughout her years of enslavement. For Ruth, treating Clara as an equal meant abandoning the paternalistic attitudes that her upbringing had taught her were appropriate in relationships with enslaved people. Their collaboration had created a unique dynamic where Clara's intelligence and planning abilities were matched with Ruth's access and resources, while Ruth's emotional investment in proving her rejection of her family's values complemented Clara's practical focus on survival and protection of her community. The relationship had evolved into something resembling true partnership, though both women remained aware of the fundamental differences in their situations and the potential consequences they would face if their activities were discovered. Dr. Henry Patterson's increased presence at the plantation had added another layer of complexity to the situation that Clara and her allies needed to monitor and understand. Patterson's medical examinations of enslaved people had become more frequent and more invasive, with particular attention paid to young women who might be candidates for sale to specialized markets. His clinical approach to evaluating human beings for commercial purposes had reinforced the community's understanding of how completely the Whitmore family viewed them as property rather than people. Patterson's medical records had become part of the documentation that supported Benjamin's business correspondence, providing professional assessments that enhanced the market value of people being considered for sale. The doctor's involvement had lent an air of scientific legitimacy to activities that were purely commercial, while his clinical language had disguised the brutal reality of human trafficking behind medical terminology that made the transactions appear respectable. Clara's observations of Patterson's activities had revealed the extent to which his medical knowledge was being used to facilitate exploitation rather than to provide healing or comfort. His examinations focused on characteristics that would be valued by buyers rather than on health conditions that might affect the well-being of the people being evaluated. His recommendations about diet, exercise, and treatment were designed to enhance appearance and compliance, rather than to address medical needs or concerns. The doctor's presence had also introduced new security considerations that affected the community's planning for resistance activities. Patterson's professional status and his connections to other influential families in the region made him a potential source of external support for the Whitmore family if they faced challenges to their authority. His medical expertise could also be used to treat injuries or identify evidence of resistance activities that might not be apparent to casual observation. These concerns had led Clara and her allies to develop more sophisticated methods of communication and coordination that could operate under increased surveillance. The community's existing networks had been refined to account for Patterson's presence and his potential ability to interpret signs of tension or unusual activity that might escape the notice of the Whitmore family members. Development of these enhanced security measures had demonstrated the community's growing sophistication in organizing resistance while highlighting the increasing risks they faced as external pressures mounted. The summer of 1861 had brought news of military developments that affected both the plantation's economic situation and the broader context for any resistance activities the community might undertake. Confederate recruitment efforts had removed many young white men from the region, reducing the availability of overseers and patrol members who normally provided security for plantation operations. This reduction in external support had made plantation owners increasingly dependent on their own resources for maintaining control over their enslaved populations. Simultaneously, reports of Union military successes in other parts of Louisiana had created hope within enslaved communities throughout the region, while also increasing the determination of plantation owners to prevent any organized resistance that might encourage broader rebellion. The combination of reduced security resources and heightened anxiety had created an unstable situation where both opportunities and dangers were greater than they had been during peacetime conditions. Clara's analysis of these changing conditions had convinced her that the window for effective action was narrowing rapidly. The Whitmore family's financial pressures were accelerating their plans for selling community members, while regional instability was making escape and resistance more feasible, but also more dangerous. The convergence of these factors had created a situation where decisive action was becoming necessary for survival, while delay increased the likelihood that the worst of Benjamin's plans would be implemented before they could be prevented. The community's collective preparation for potential action had revealed both their strengths and their limitations in confronting the plantation's power structure. Their intelligence network was sophisticated and comprehensive, their mutual support systems were strong, and their understanding of the family's vulnerabilities was detailed and accurate. However, their resources were limited, their experience with organized resistance was minimal, and their ability to coordinate complex activities under surveillance was untested. Clara's position at the center of these preparations had made her acutely aware of the weight of responsibility that was settling on her shoulders. The community's trust in her intelligence and judgment had created expectations that she was not certain she could fulfill, while her knowledge of the family's plans had made her the person most qualified to develop strategies for preventing their implementation. The convergence of opportunity and necessity was forcing her to move beyond careful observation and planning toward the kind of decisive action that would change everything forever. Part 7. The pressure mounts. The late summer heat seemed to amplify every tension that had been building within the Oakmont plantation as August 1861 brought news that would accelerate all of Benjamin Whitmore's plans beyond anything Clara and her allies had anticipated. A Confederate messenger had arrived at dawn with correspondence that sent Benjamin into a flurry of activity, summoning Daniel for urgent conferences while dispatching riders to neighboring plantations with messages that suggested coordinated action was being planned across the region. Clara's access to the study during her regular sewing duties had allowed her to observe the aftermath of these urgent communications, and what she discovered chilled her to the bone. The Confederate government was implementing new policies that required plantation owners to contribute specific quotas of enslaved people for military construction projects, while simultaneously offering premium prices for enslaved women who could be provided to newly established facilities serving Confederate officers and officials. The correspondence that Clara managed to read during her brief opportunities in the study revealed that Benjamin had volunteered Oakmont to participate in both programs, seeing them as solutions to his mounting financial pressures and as patriotic contributions to the Confederate cause. The lists he had prepared for submission to military authorities included not only men for construction work, but also the names of young women whose sale to military brothels would provide immediate cash while eliminating potential complications from their presence on the plantation. More devastating still was Clara's discovery that the timeline for these contributions had been accelerated due to urgent military needs. Rather than the gradual implementation Benjamin had originally planned, the Confederate requirements demanded immediate action, with transportation arrangements to be completed within days rather than weeks. The bureaucratic efficiency of military organization was about to transform Benjamin's commercial plans into immediate reality, with a speed that left no time for gradual preparation or careful resistance. The urgency of these developments had created panic within the enslaved community as word of the new requirements spread through their informal communication networks. The people whose names appeared on Benjamin's lists understood that their time at Oakmont was measured in days, while everyone else recognized that successful resistance to these particular demands would require immediate and decisive action rather than the careful long-term planning they had been developing. Moses Freeman had called an emergency gathering in the stables that brought together the community's informal leadership to address the crisis that was unfolding around them.
The meeting had been disguised as routine maintenance work, but the intensity of the discussions that took place under cover of normal activities had made clear to everyone involved that the moment for decisive action had arrived, whether they were prepared for it or not. Samuel Porter's reports from the fields had confirmed that Confederate officials were expected to arrive within the week to inspect the people who would be transferred to military service and to oversee transportation arrangements that would remove them from the plantation permanently. The efficiency of military logistics meant that once these officials arrived, any opportunity for preventing the transfers would disappear, as the individuals involved would be moved immediately to locations where rescue or escape would be virtually impossible. Betsy Williams had gathered additional intelligence from her network of house servants and kitchen workers that revealed the extent to which the Whitmore family was preparing for major changes in plantation operations. Constance had begun inventorying
household possessions and making arrangements for temporary management of domestic responsibilities, suggesting that the family anticipated significant disruption to their normal routines. Daniel had increased his consultations with overseers from neighboring plantations about security measures that might be necessary during the transition period. Most ominously, Dr. Patterson had arrived at the plantation with medical supplies and documentation that suggested he was preparing to conduct final examinations of the people selected for transfer. His previous visits had been for evaluation purposes, but his current preparation indicated that formal medical certification was required before the transfers could be completed. The doctor's presence also meant that any resistance activities would face not only the Whitmore family's retaliation, but also potential intervention from someone with professional status and community connections. Clara's conversations with Ruth during this period had revealed the extent to which even Benjamin's own daughter was disturbed by the acceleration of his plans. Ruth's emotional distress about her family's activities had intensified as she realized that her father's correspondence with Confederate authorities was moving beyond commercial transactions to become part of the official war effort. Her understanding that resistance to these plans would constitute treason against the Confederate government had added legal and political dimensions to moral concerns that already overwhelmed her ability to maintain emotional equilibrium. Ruth's access to family discussions had provided Clara with crucial intelligence about the specific timing and logistics of the planned transfers. Benjamin's meetings with Confederate officials had established exact dates for inspections and transportation, while his correspondence with Dr. Patterson had revealed the medical procedures that would be required before people could be released to military custody. This detailed information had allowed Clara to understand precisely how little time remained for any action that might prevent the implementation of Benjamin's plans. More importantly, Ruth's reports about her family's discussions had revealed significant anxiety about potential resistance from the enslaved community and concern about maintaining security during the transition period. Benjamin and Daniel had discussed the possibility that knowledge of the transfers might provoke escape attempts or organized rebellion, leading them to implement additional surveillance measures and to request additional support from neighboring plantation owners who might assist in maintaining control. These security concerns had created both obstacles and opportunities for any resistance activities that Clara and her allies might organize. The increased surveillance made covert planning more difficult and dangerous, while the family's obvious anxiety about potential resistance indicated their awareness of their own vulnerability during this period of transition. The knowledge that the Whitmore family expected resistance had provided Clara with psychological leverage, while also highlighting the need for actions that would be more decisive and comprehensive than anything they had previously contemplated. Clara's analysis of the situation had convinced her that the crisis required abandoning the careful long-term planning she had been developing in favor of immediate action that would prevent the transfers from taking place. The Confederate timeline left no opportunity for gradual preparation or careful coordination, while the military nature of the transfers meant that once they began, the individuals involved would be beyond the reach of any rescue efforts the community might organize. The realization that immediate action was necessary had forced Clara to confront the reality that preventing the transfers would require not just resistance, but the complete destruction of the Whitmore family's ability to implement their plans. Benjamin's correspondence and documentation would need to be destroyed to prevent military authorities from identifying the individuals selected for transfer, while the family's own capacity for coordination with Confederate officials would need to be eliminated to prevent them from simply recreating their arrangements through alternative channels. These requirements had led Clara to focus her planning on Benjamin's study as the crucial target for any action she might take against the family. The study contained not only the documentation that supported the transfer arrangements, but also the communication systems that allowed Benjamin to coordinate with Confederate authorities and other plantation owners. Destroying the study would eliminate both the immediate evidence of his plans and his ability to recreate those plans through continued correspondence and coordination. More significantly, Clara's observations of Benjamin's habits had revealed that he was spending increasing amounts of time in the study during evening hours as he worked to finalize arrangements with Confederate officials. His dedication to completing these arrangements had made him predictable in his location and timing, creating opportunities for action that might not exist once the transfers began and his attention shifted to managing the logistics of implementation. The study's physical characteristics had made it an ideal target for the kind of decisive action that the current crisis demanded. The room's extensive collection of books and papers provided abundant fuel for fire, while its location on the ground floor of the main house would allow flames to spread rapidly throughout the building. The heavy wooden furniture and thick carpets would sustain and intensify any blaze that began in the room, while the tall windows could create drafts that would accelerate the fire's spread. Clara's knowledge of fabrics and materials from her sewing work had given her insights into fire behavior that most people lacked, allowing her to plan an approach that would ensure maximum destruction in minimum time. Her access to oils and other materials used in textile work had provided her with accelerants that could guarantee rapid ignition and sustained burning, while her familiarity with the study's layout had allowed her to identify optimal placement for materials that would ensure complete destruction of both contents and structure. The timing of such an action had become crucial, as Clara realized that Benjamin's evening work sessions in the study created opportunities to ensure that the destruction of his plans would be accompanied by the elimination of his ability to recreate them. His presence in the room during a fire would prevent him from escaping to continue his correspondence with Confederate authorities, while also serving as justice for the decades of suffering he had inflicted on the people under his control. Ruth's potential involvement in such
an action had become both necessary and problematic as Clara considered the practical requirements for success. Ruth's access to keys and her knowledge of family routines would be essential for ensuring that the action could be implemented without premature discovery, while her ability to create alibis and misdirect attention could be crucial for protecting the community from retaliation. However, her emotional volatility and her lack of experience with violence made her a risky partner whose involvement could jeopardize the entire operation. Clara's discussions with Ruth about the possibility of taking action against her own family had revealed both the young woman's commitment to preventing the transfers and her psychological preparation for extreme measures. Ruth's horror at her father's plans had overcome her remaining family loyalty, while her understanding of the consequences facing the people on Benjamin's lists had motivated her to accept the necessity for decisive action, regardless of the personal cost to herself. The community's collective preparation for potential action had revealed their understanding that the current crisis represented a turning point that would determine the future of everyone at Oakmont. The Confederate requirements had created a situation where passive resistance was no longer sufficient to protect the community's most vulnerable members, while the timeline for implementation left no opportunity for gradual escalation or careful preparation. Moses Freeman's counsel during this period had emphasized the moral responsibility that came with the power to prevent suffering and the ethical imperative to act when action was possible. His wisdom had helped Clara understand that the choice she faced was not between violence and peace,
but between allowing the systematic destruction of her community and taking action to prevent that destruction through whatever means were necessary. The weight of this responsibility had settled on Clara's shoulders as she realized that her unique position and knowledge made her the person most capable of preventing the implementation of Benjamin's plans. The combination of her intelligence, her access to the study, her understanding of the family's vulnerabilities, and her relationships with both the enslaved community and Ruth Whitmore had created opportunities for action that no one else possessed. The late August heat had become oppressive as Clara finalized her preparations for the action that would determine the fate of everyone at Oakmont. The Confederate officials were expected within days, making immediate action necessary regardless of any remaining concerns about preparation or coordination. The study that had been her sanctuary of learning and intelligence gathering was about to become the focal point of justice that would transform the plantation forever. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out.